Well, in general, I would regard interactive media design as thinking very carefully about how people, looking closely at how people interact, obviously, with media, what happens when they select, choose, and manipulate media, and then also looking at what about the medium encourages them to do certain things. And so technically would mean looking at certain design features. Let me step back for a moment, and if we talk about print media, we've traditionally looked at things like how large the photographs are, how wide the text columns are in newspapers, how much distance there is, space there is between lines, the leading issue. And what that suggests is that there are certain design standards that have developed to make newspapers and magazines easy to read. And what I'm interested in is looking at, in this class, the interactive media design class, looking at what are similar issues that encourage people to use websites, browse to certain areas, respond in certain ways to certain elements. And it's a relatively broad term, because I think it's not just web design. It's also, if you would prefer to say, it's Blu-ray menu design, it's DVD design, it's video game design. There are a broad range of things that we increasingly interact with. Social media, portable media devices, and each one of them has media content, whether that's the actual programming in it, in terms of the firmware, the operating system, or it's the actual media material that people are accessing through it. So I think looking at the interactions is critical. It's often called usability research. That's a component of it, but it's not the only thing, because I think usability tends to ignore the earlier print media issues like the leading and the column width and so on. So it's a sort of a merger of the two. This class started off as a class that I worked on as a graduate student, actually. So I started teaching an equivalent version of this class in 1995. This is 2 years after the web became sort of generally accessible. And at that point, the class involved relatively free-form projects. At that point, standards were still developing, and even basic web page structures. It was difficult at that point to get a picture and text on the same page in a way that was graphically pleasing. So the projects were relatively wide open. Students would choose topics and then develop very simple websites, often with interactive elements. At that point, there might be basic animation, but often links and things like this. But the idea was to essentially participate in the design process, to try and develop and learn about innovative design features. And so at that point, because it was still relatively new, we spent some time on the history of the web, the history of the internet, so that people could understand the constraints and the possibilities of the technology at that time. More recent versions of the class have moved away from that, because it's sort of given that we now have relatively established standards, even though they're still evolving, but there's not as much wide or freedom to create, I would say, really innovative features now as a beginner, certainly. And so and there are a lot more materials available. There are a lot more books, textbooks, programs that we can choose from. So my goal has moved from having people do really nuts and bolts work, hand coding HTML at the beginning, learning about the history, developing projects really from the ground up, to having projects that are sort of half-started. We went through a phase where we were redesigning existing websites that were poorly designed on campus, sort of as a volunteer project that I think was successful at that stage. But then we moved to templates, which is sort of more of a standard now, where the basic design is set up, and now you have to think about what content would go in those templates. And that's becoming a really common feature in the journalism world, is that you're given a content management system with existing templates with not a lot of leeway. You have to be really creative in how you handle those constraints. I think what's interesting is that usability issues are still really key. Sort of the larger issues, the larger concerns about how do we evaluate interactivity, how do we encourage certain types of behavior and discourage other types. These remain consistent concerns, or persistent concerns, in what we do in terms of design. But what I think has changed is worrying about the details of the technology. Now so many resources are available to people online. You can go to Google Sites, for example, and do what used to cost a lot of money with Dreamweaver, for example, or other similar applications. One area that I think is really important for me in this class to think about is I don't expect people to be really technically proficient by the end. Of course, it's wonderful if they are, but I do expect people to leave from a class like this with the ability to evaluate websites, to provide design feedback. Sort of the ideal job I would see somebody getting based on this course would be as a manager of web projects, where they're basically speccing websites, responding to very technically sophisticated sites that somebody else has produced, and giving suggestions that are actually informed design considerations rather than just sort of random responses about liking or disliking something. Well, why do you like it? Why do you think it should work this way? What would make it better? So they can be in a position to sort of evaluate and manage projects more with an informed view of what's going on, rather than just hand coding everything. So that's where I see the progression going, and that's typical for media as they emerge. And the same thing happened with radio, with television. In the early days, people were doing very basic handcrafting episodes, and now TV shows are based on templates. 60 Minutes is based on a template, for example. So we're seeing the evolution, the maturation of the discipline in that area. Blogging is important for several reasons. One is that it's a new technology, and we have to be aware of new technologies, and we have to be able to evaluate them in terms of their pros and cons. So I think it's important, even if it were an absolutely worthless new technology, by most people's evaluation, it would still be important to look at and try and figure out why is it working, why is it being used in certain ways. I think blogging is also important to understand and appreciate, because there's an amazing amount of information out there in blogs. For me, the technology is not the key thing, it's how people use the technology. So there are fantastic blogs done by really interesting people about interesting topics that are structured very well. So those are definitely worth looking at. The same technology can be used very poorly by other people who are basically just posting the equivalent of spam on it. In terms of using blogs and authoring blogs, I think it's critical to know about the technology, because it could be a useful component in a relatively mainstream media site as well. So that I see as a key part of this class too, is being able to say, okay, there's a new technology coming out. I mean, blogs were a couple of years ago, Twitter was 2 years ago, or it certainly got prominence last year. What's going to be coming out this year? What's going to be coming out next year? There's always something new. And so the important thing to do, I think, is to learn how to evaluate these new things as they come out the gate, because a new graduate will be the person that a lot of folks turn to at a company as being sort of representative of a younger generation that's technically proficient. It's like, okay, new hire who has some experience from university in a web design class. What do you guys think of new technology X, Y, or Z? How would you use it? How are young people using it? How can we exploit it, basically? So that's absolutely key.